2023 Whitehead Lectures. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Allison Simmons. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here. And I have the very great pleasure of reintroducing this year's speaker, Peter Godfrey-Smith. Now, it's tradition that on the second day of the Whiteheads, we dispense with some of the formalities. Bernard has already introduced you to all of the accolades that Peter has received. My job is color commentary. I'm supposed to provide a little human context, and this should make our speaker nervous. I've known Peter for a very long time, and I tend to overshare. But I have promised to exercise self-control. We do that at Harvard. So I met Peter at the dawn of the 1990s, which I know for some of you was like, what? The 19 what? I was a grad student at Penn, and Peter was a grad student at UCSD. And Penn was considering Peter for a job, so they brought him to Philadelphia, and of course the graduate students got the chance to meet and talk with him. So we met in the grungy grad lounge. Grad lounges are always grungy. And talked for about an hour, after which I forgot to turn my phone on. I won't start over. Sorry, babe. We're talking to the graduates, after which we all pretty much decided he was the coolest philosopher on the planet. So the cool thing, Bernard and I did not work together on this, but it will come up. Although you focused on the work. We got there, but it's true that I should say, we had a very high bar for cool at Penn because Sally Haslinger and Alexander Nehamas were on our faculty. They pretty much defined cool in the 1990s. Then Peter came along and there was a little challenge. Now, for us, partly it was the fact that Peter plays jazz saxophone and kept asking where all the good clubs are. And he told us he likes to do philosophy in hot tubs, which I gather they do in San Diego, but we did not do in Philadelphia. And he had a bit of a reputation for, let's just say, creating a ruckus at the APA hotels, at the bars at the hotel. So that was pretty cool. But really, the main thing was the work, as Bernard indicated. We thought he was doing incredibly cool philosophy. At Penn, we were taught that you can't do philosophy without knowing something. That the best philosophy is engaging with some other body of knowledge or work, and we took that quite seriously. And Peter, with his work, was really showing us how to do that with a very exciting project in both philosophy of mind and philosophy of biology. At the time, mostly you were working on biological functions. So that was pretty exciting to us. In the end, Peter did not come to Penn. He went to Stanford, where he started his career in the happy land of naturalism, where that sort of thing was normal. A couple of years later, I came to Harvard, where that sort of thing was not normal. And I learned that the hard way. There was an early discussion. We were thinking of hiring somebody in philosophy of mind. And I said, well, why don't we hire somebody who's engaged in empirical psychology and brings the two together? The room went silent. Silent. Like, where did this one come from? How did we let her in? I sort of felt like I had suggested hiring someone's ex. And I realized I kind of had, in a way. Because later I realized, look, Harvard is the place of the great divorce between philosophy on the one hand and psychology on the other in the early 20th century. So I'm an historian. Let me tell you a little bit of the history here. So at the very turn of the century, there was a year-long introductory course in this department, Phil 1, and it worked this way. The fall semester was logic. My logician colleagues were like, the whole semester you had to take logic. And then the spring semester, you took either psychology with William James, or you took history of philosophy with George Herbert Palmer. One or the other. So you see the rift was already underway between the two disciplines. In 1913, the department was officially named the Department of Philosophy and Psychology. Right, so they're separating a bit. And then eventually in 1934, after years of internal strife, the two fields divorced. And separate departments were established in the division of philosophy and psychology. And now, of course, psychology is in yet another division in the social sciences. So the rift has grown over the years. It was as if, with my suggestion, I had resurrected the spirits of James and Palmer they've been keeping them locked in the basement where the grad offices are right now. Wonder what's going on down there. That's what's going on down there. And happily, we're demolishing those offices this summer. So I take that as symbolic. Okay, but time brings change, and it didn't actually take that long. 2 years after I came, we hired my longtime colleague and good friend, Susanna Siegel, who was bringing philosophy and psychology together. And then, much to my delight, Peter joined the department in 2006. Now, this chapter of Peter's life might be called Adventures of a Naturalist at Harvard, or in the Land of Normativity. He talked causas, we talked reasons. He talked explanations. We talked justifications. He talked Darwin. We talked Kant. We looked at him. Is it conscious? Well, I don't know. I have to see if it's a rational agent, determine if it's conscious. But I don't think your time at Harvard was easy, but it was productive, I think, for all of us. He had a profound effect on both grad students and faculty, and among other things, I will say we never took up the hot tub thing. But what did happen is he encouraged us all to think outside the philosophical box. In fact, to rethink the philosophical box itself. That's precisely what he thinks empirical work can do for philosophy, as you started to see yesterday. New things have to be learned, he writes in Metazoa. But as they're learned, he continues, the problem itself changes shape and fades. Now, yesterday, Peter illustrated that for us. He illustrated one way in which learning about the complex lives of other critters helps to change the shape of the stubborn problem of mind or consciousness or sentience. This is another quote from Peter. By exploring animal life, again in Metazoa, we build around the problem of mind or consciousness or sentience and see it transform and subside, end of the quote. Empirical work doesn't answer philosophical questions, but sometimes it changes them. Perhaps we need to rethink our questions about consciousness. Today, Peter turns his attention to questions more familiar to people in this department. What obligations does this transformed conception of mind or consciousness bring with it? What do we owe our newfound sentient friends? I find myself wondering whether this question too will be shaped for us today. He may be wondering that too. But please join me in welcoming again Peter Godfrey-Smith.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alison. Okay, my voice is like this. I've had quite a few days of non-stop conversations, several events, but I think I have 2 hours of voice left in me. Okay, the first lecture was a discussion of the biology of felt experience, sentience, with a focus on the beginnings, the liminal forms, the ground floor, and the sub-basement. I argued for a view of the biological basis of experience and also its distribution, or really at the end of the talk, a cluster of views on that issue, hard to pull apart. But a broad distribution of sentience compared to other positions is seen in all of the views in that cluster. I think we can reject a restriction of felt experience to mammals or vertebrates, by way of the idea that only those animals have the right kind of brain. There's lots of neural multiple realizability of subjectivity relevant traits. Behavioral complexity evolved on several different lines in animals after very early branchings. It evolved in contexts of different kinds of bodies and brains and lifestyles, different architectures. All these different bodies, brains, and architectures allowed for good vision, complex behavior, and learning. We have invertebrates with conspicuous apparent marks for a place of felt experience in their lives, especially in cephalopods and crustaceans. The setting also included a commitment to gradualism about the history and graded presence as likely today. No sharp lines, no light that turns on. With that last move, the gradualist move, we reach a tangle of issues, both substantive and terminological, about whether something is a version of subjective experience or felt experience, or something else that's a bit like felt experience. Now, I expect that imperfect posing of the issue to get replaced by a finer-grained vocabulary that's yet to come, but I tend towards a view where what's conspicuous in the three special lines exists in fainter but real forms in other groups. Okay, that's as far as we got. The main topic today is as follows. It's common to see a coordination between sentience and some sort of moral considerability, moral standing, as it's sometimes put. It's common to think something like this, that all and only sentient beings are morally considerable, deserve moral concern, something like that. Ideas of this kind are often referred to now as sentientism. Now, the idea, I think, is now all over and often implicit in the background in practical discussions. If one thinks something like this, it is obviously important to work out who is sentient. Whether there's a broadening to insects, maybe even to plants, or a narrowing to vertebrates, perhaps mammals, any shaping like that will have a lot of consequences. And that's the main topic of this lecture, how that principle coordinating sentience and moral concern relates to the philosophy of mind issues from the previous lecture. So I'll first look at those principles in a general way, the bridging principles, then look at their role within some discussions of ethics and animals, especially the place of sentience within some recent non-utilitarian discussions in books by Korsgaard and Nussbaum. Along the way, I'll also fill out the philosophy of mind side, trying to tie up some loose ends from yesterday, and at the end, I will sketch a positive view on these matters. Okay, the sentience principle. I've got it on the handout there at the top. I'll use that formulation of the principle we'll be discussing. All and only sentient beings have interests worthy of moral consideration. So there's the all side and the only side. Both of them raise questions. In my formulation, interests worthy of is supposed to be weaker than demand or require. Issues I won't consider include forward-looking or proleptic attributions, what to say about beings liable to become sentient even if they're not so now, and also issues that involve decisions about who will come to exist and who won't, as opposed to the interests of beings assumed to exist. I'm just going to keep things simple with respect to those issues. I take that principle to be familiar within utilitarianism. It's seen in Bentham's famous passage about the right question to ask about who deserves moral consideration. He said, don't ask of some creatures, can they reason and talk and so on, but instead ask, can they suffer? That's the question. Peter Singer, in his book, Practical Ethics, expresses the idea clearly. That's also on the handout. The limit of sentience, using the term as convenient, if not strictly accurate shorthand for the capacity to suffer or experience enjoyment or happiness, is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. Now, the context in Singer's discussion there is a discussion of equal consideration, but he also endorses the basic view, which is logically weaker than the equal consideration version. Some differences between forms of utilitarianism, between preference and hedonic versions, become relevant here. I say that to people familiar with those discussions, but I won't be talking much about utilitarian views anyway. And when it's relevant, it will be a kind of experience-centered version of utilitarianism that's on the table. Now, eventually I will look at some issues about the status of the principle. There's a relatively simple way the principle could be understood. There is this property, sentience, and this other property, moral status, and the two have a tight connection. In some recent discussions in the philosophy of mind, it tends to be discussed like that. Moral status is taken to be a property that we can have intuitions about. Sentience is also a property, usually discussed as an on-off matter, where this is compatible with what I yesterday referred to as weak gradualism, the idea of a hop onto the escalator and then gradations from there. So the grammar or the pattern of lots of discussion at the moment tends to be moral realist and intuitionist, whether this reflects people's real commitments or not. And I'll come back to that, but I'm going to leave it open for now. The sentience principle has some further complexity. Sometimes the term sentience or sentient is used equivalently with a term like phenomenal consciousness to refer to any kind of felt experience. Sometimes it's used more narrowly for experience that includes a capacity for pain and pleasure, perhaps along with other evaluative forms of experience. And then we can divide, this is a sort of fairly standard setup just below the singer on the handout, narrow sentientism, the idea that moral status goes with being conscious where this includes the capacity for pleasure and pain, and broad sentientism, the idea that it goes with experience of any kind, whether or not it includes pleasure and pain. A discussion has arisen in the last year or so around some thought experiments, especially via David Chalmers, featuring imaginary Vulcans who are conscious but not sentient in the pleasure and pain sense, where these imagined agents are about as complex as people and behave in fairly normal ways, but they have this neat hole in their experiential life. Now, I'm very doubtful of the thought experiment in that form, but in neurally simpler animals, where it's not a matter of preserving a human-like behavioral profile, it is worth thinking about. And for a time, I wondered whether insects might be in a situation like this. When we think of their perceptual abilities and the demands of flight, in the case of some insects, such as bees and flies, a form of perceptual experience looks likely, and people who work on that topic often think something like that. But various reports suggested also that insects might have a hole in their experience in relation to pain. Not in relation to all evaluation-related capacities. Later I'll discuss mood-like states or emotion-like states, but in relation to acute pain from damage. Some insect people always said to me, heat is the aversive stimulus we should look at here, not bodily damage, which is what people had initially studied. And then just last year, a hole in our understanding and a possible hole in plausible experiential profiles for some insects was filled by an important paper from the lab of Lars Chitka. Chitka's the guy who recently published a book called The Mind of a Bee, here with first author Matilda Gibbons. They found, finally, exactly the same kind of evaluative trade-offs in bumblebees that had been taken for some years to be good evidence for felt pain in their crustacean relatives, and with some further complexity. Basically, the bees avoided heat in a food source area in a way that was finely calibrated with the superiority of the heated over an unheated food source. And that's exactly the kind of thing that had not been seen before this and that was puzzling. Bees are such sophisticated learners, even showing cultural learning by copying their fellows, that this kind of gap in their experiential profiles seemed puzzling, and now there's evidence for no gap. Now, this is of course not decisive and should not be extrapolated to all insects, but I use this work and other work from the Chitka lab to justify the idea mentioned yesterday that insects are no longer the frontier case for animals where there's decent evidence of experience. Together with some of the fly work that I mentioned then, by Van Swinderen in particular, insects are now in the group where there's quite a lot that can be said on the yes side. Now, this, of course, is very significant. Insects have often been used as foil cases in ethics discussions. Look after the cows, don't look after the insects. Peter Carruthers once argued that not worrying about insects is a constraint on sensible moral views, and hence a potential problem for utilitarianism. Insects are often now advocated as a protein source, and this would involve massive numbers. More generally, their interests and human interests tend not to be well aligned, to put it mildly. Now, an in-principle possibility of a gap in evaluative experience remains. Wow, my voice is really going to This will test the voice. Remains even if insects don't occupy it, or again, maybe if some insects do. All choices of action have a fact-related and an evaluative side. What do I want to get, and how do I get it in these circumstances? We can imagine a kind of threshold model relating cognition and felt experience. A model motivated in part by the recognition that some simple kinds of cognition are just about everywhere in cellular life. And then even if all action implicitly involves a factual side and a preference side, you might imagine that there are some organisms who are over threshold on the perceptual side and not on the other, and perhaps vice versa. Now, I take this possibility less empirically seriously than I used to, but it's part of the landscape. Anyway, below, when I talk about sentience, I'll generally assume we're talking about experiential profiles that do include an evaluative side. The specific roles of pleasure and pain will come up again later. Most philosophers now do not see utilitarianism as viable as a general ethical theory, especially because of its disregard for what Rawls called the distinction between persons and considerations of distribution. It seems to treat pleasure as a good stuff wherever it's found, with individual organisms regarded as receptacles for it, as Tom Regan has expressed it. I will sometimes look at or bump into approaches that I'll call welfarist without being utilitarian, where the sentience principle is endorsed and experience is all that matters, but there's no summing over individuals. We consider the good of each individual on its own. Now, that's not much of an outline of a view because we've said nothing so far about conflicts and equity, but it's a piece of several possible views. I'll spend more time, though, on views that are further from utilitarianism, views based more on the individual as agent, as chooser, than as experiencer. These views started out as frameworks aimed at the human case and have been modified and extended to deal with non-human animals. Now, when those extensions were done, considerations of sentience ended up back on the table. The views I'll discuss are the ones in Korsgaard's Fellow Creatures and Nussbaum's Justice for Animals. Okay, first Korsgaard. Korsgaard uses a Kantian framework drawing also on Aristotle. Agents of certain kinds choose what is good for them. We as agents ourselves, who make our own choices of what is good, and see these choices as defensible and a basis for claims on others not to interfere with us, find ourselves also bound to respect the choices of others. Their goods, too, become effectively absolute, recognizable, and motivating from all perspectives. That's the kind of core of Fellow Creatures. Now, I've criticized this argument, this attempt to leverage our own sense of ourselves as agents into a concern for others in another essay on the handout. I won't revisit any of those issues here. I'll just be looking at the role of sentience. Officially in Fellow Creatures, agency is what matters, making choices. But the relevant kind of agency turns out to require sentience. So the book opens in the way I have there as the first Korsgaard quote on the handout. In this book, I defend the claim that we human beings are obligated to treat all sentient animals, those who have subjective experiences that are pleasant or painful, as what Kant called ends in themselves. And I put a few more Korsgaard quotes on the handout. Martha Nussbaum's book, Justice for Animals, came out just earlier this year. Here she modifies the capabilities approach, one that she has helped develop for the human case and especially in the context of development economics with Amartya Sen and others. The new book is an extension of that approach to the animal case, developing a treatment that was part of her earlier Tanner lectures. Now, injustice in general for Nussbaum is a matter of wrongful thwarting, wrongful interference with action and projects. Animals, like humans, lead lives of what she calls significant striving, and she argues it is unjust to thwart their forms of striving. I've put a couple of quotes expressing those ideas on the handout. For Nussbaum, as for Korsgaard, not all animals are included here, only those who are sentient. So again, agency drives the view, choice, striving, seeking your good. It's not utilitarian, it's not based on feelings and experience, it's based on choice, but there is again a restriction to sentient beings. Both books discuss plants as contrasting cases and also some animals. And the intention here in both cases is not to have an ad hoc move that prevents the view from having an awkward amount of breadth, but to have a motivated restriction to sentience. And that then gives us some questions for today. What is the relation between the agency side and the experiential side in these views and in nature itself? Why the extra clause? Why do you have to add the extra clause? Might it be better in one case or both to make the case with the agency idea only, or perhaps with a different restriction? And then how do the two elements here, agency and sentience, relate to questions about grey area cases and gradations? Okay, so those are the main questions. And what I'll do is discuss both how things look under my own preferred view of sentience and how things look within other more common views, the ones that I referred to as narrow pathway views in the previous lecture. And I think the narrow pathway views are worth discussing up front to show some of the contours of the situation. The whole idea, the motivating thought of those projects is the idea that lots of coherent behavior can be produced wholly unconsciously, and felt experience involves a special pathway of some kind. This special path is relevant to agency. It involves, in many of these views, sophisticated, attentive behaviors, at least in us, but it's optional for the basics. It's optional for the basic kinds of goal-directed behavior in animals. And narrow pathway views tend to make sentience itself look problematic in most non-human animals, certainly outside mammals. Now, if narrow pathway views were right, ethical projects like this might still proceed. What they might do is either associate moral consideration only with agency that is sophisticated enough to require consciousness. So you keep the sentience principle, but the bar is thereby raised very high, and you will capture some particular kinds of agency as well. Or, in a more inclusive view, you might treat sentience as a kind of add-on. The idea is you need an agent pursuing their good. This is actually not a more inclusive view. It's a different way of doing a not a very inclusive view. You need an agent pursuing their good and one that's sentient, or you might leave the sentience principle behind. You have those options within narrow pathway views. Now, in the view I presented in lecture 1, there's a lot of coordination between agency and sentience, much more than there is in narrow pathway views. The evolution of agency, not from its complete absence, but the evolution of animal forms of it, brings with it a cluster of subjectivity-related features. The full treatment of felt experience also includes a role for features of nervous systems. Nervous systems are how animals achieve agency. How in general animals achieve agency. Non-neural animals have very minimal agency. There's just a few cases of wholly non-nervous system possessing animals. So sentience and agency are at least tightly connected by evolution. Now, here I want to also add an element to the philosophy of mind side that has to do with the nature of evaluative experience. And this will push the category of sentience even a little deeper, perhaps, than I have so far. Pleasure and pain are the standard topics here, and I've talked about octopus, insect, and crustacean pain. But there's more to aversive experience, just thinking about the negative side for now, than this. As well as pain, for all of us, there's stress, alarm, fear, states like that. Perhaps surprisingly, the evidence for some of these in invertebrates has for a while been somewhat strong. and in some cases stronger than evidence for acute pain. The main reason to hesitate about this evidence is the fact that some of the animals concerned are so simple in their nervous systems. So I have here in mind what we might call mood-like states in insects and gastropods, snails and slugs. They're sometimes described as emotion-like, but I think mood-like is in some ways a particularly good description. As an example of these phenomena, running well and truly into frontier territory, there is what's called nociceptive sensitization. Most of the work that I make use of on this was done by Terry Walters. There's some papers of his on the handout. This is a heightened and general sensitivity after damage or after an aversive stimulus. It's seen in gastropods and also in fly larvae in the little grub-like early stages. Electric shock tends to be used as the aversive stimulus in this work, and as well as inducing immediate responses and associative learning, it leads to a kind of general sensitization. As Crook and Walters put it, that quote's not in the handout, it seems that memory of a noxious event in snails can be linked to a fear-like motivational state that can dramatically alter the animal's response to other biologically significant stimuli. So it's a kind of general fear-like sensitized downer state that is induced. Now, in more complicated cases like octopuses, it's the integrated nature of a response to a bad event, it being not reflex-like, not simple, but something pervading several behavioral contexts that supports, I think, an experiential interpretation, and we discussed that with the Crook experiment yesterday. Here, in the case of nociceptive sensitization, we have the very faintest version of something like that like that kind of integrated and pervasive effect of an aversive stimulus, it not just being a little local arc within the animal. And this reaches deep into the puzzling territory to organisms that have only tens of thousands of neurons. The question of how states like this relate to ethical views that make use of agency but also include a role for sentience is not totally straightforward and obvious. If one's concerned with experience per se, sentience per se, in an ethical context, but it's very natural to include mood-like states as ethically relevant. And Walters and his colleagues do think that these features are adaptive. They do something useful in guiding action. But whether they condition the particular goals that are sought, particular choices, in the way that pleasure and pain might, this is not so clear. Anyway, if one accepts a sentience principle, in any context, utilitarian, otherwise, then sentience will probably run very deep in the animal kingdom. Now, Korsgaard and Nussbaum both leave open the possibility that insects might be sentient. And as I've said, I think they're probably in, but they are not the only ones queuing up for the ark. Okay, that's the first point in this section. Next point. They're closely linked, but they're not completely inextricable. Sentience and agency runs deeper. If felt experience is a feature of nervous systems, then when we leave organisms with nervous systems, we are leaving felt experience, including its evaluative forms, behind. But agency, choosing, and so on, runs deeper. Now, in the case of organisms with very simple nervous systems, the same thing may apply, but here we very much encounter the problems of graded presence discussed in the first lecture. So at this stage in the paper, I'll talk about non-neural organisms such as plants. And here the point is that if it really is the active seeking of the organism's good that we're interested in, if that's what's driving the story, then forms of this feature probably outrun even the most liminal forms of sentience. I said in the first lecture, minimal cognition is all over cellular life, detecting what's going on and reacting in a way that expresses a preference. Here is an example from plants. This is from a 2019 study of the evening primrose. When exposed to a played back sound of a flying bee or a synthetic similar sound, the flowers produced sweeter nectar within 3 minutes. And this was thought to be aimed at increasing the chances of cross-pollination. The flowers themselves vibrated mechanically in response to the sounds, suggesting a mechanism where the flower serves as an auditory sensory organ. By the way, this is not the study that was all over the newspapers about a week or so about plant and sound. That one I think is not a big deal at all. This one from before I think is a big deal. Now there are lots of sort of plant cognition reports somewhat like this, but many of them are hard to interpret. And this one I think looks both clean and also very striking in how fast the adaptive response is. 3 minutes. The idea of a flower as an ear is of course also irresistible. Now, in some ways, this is not action because it's not movement. And Venus flytraps are perhaps as good an example here, at least in some ways. Animal action involves especially movement. So does a lot of protist action. The complex single-celled organisms living in that earlier and ongoing microscopic world from which animals came. Venus flytraps are also, the Venus flytrap mechanism is quite simple. And this sound case might be simple. It's very new. I don't think we know much about how it works. In that way, it's different as a kind of agency. But the good being sought is not one that's derivative on our own perspective or less real in some sense like that. It's a good for the organism, sought by the organism as best it can by tracking what's going on and responding appropriately. Now, you can have a category of good sought by an organism by way of feelings. Good that's sought by acts, through acts guided by evaluative feelings of certain kinds. I mean, you can have that category. Does that make it a different kind of good with a different status? Well, it's a different kind of seeking. It's a different form of seeking. In the non-neural cases, including the plants, the pursuit is often and might always be a lot simpler than the other kind of seeking. More complex cases may always involve sentience because of the unique role of nervous systems, the means by which agency is achieved in animals. The view I'm resisting is the idea that the kind of good itself that's being sought is inherently different when sentience is absent. Now, Korsgaard at a few points wonders if plants might be at a low point on a continuum for her purposes, with conscious animals at the other end. In relation to sentience, I as I've said, I doubt it, but I don't know. I mean, for me, plants are in the no category, at least so far. In relation to agency, though, I think they pass the sorts of tests that Korsgaard lays down as central to her view. Korsgaard allows that if the plant-animal difference is one of degree, then, and this is a quote, plants would be, in a very elementary sense, agents, and so might be said to have a final good. A final good is the kind of good that is ethically significant. In other cases, in the book, Korsgaard stipulates that organisms who represent the world and seek their own good are animals. This is a special animal category designed for her purposes, not a biologist's sense of animal, but one fashioned for this context. Now, having plants in or quasi in the animal category would make things look linguistically odd, but that's not a big deal. The category still might do the work intended. A more important issue would then be the size of the category. That would be surprising, at least. And then I would add that the final good category is not simply aligned with a category based on sentience. We could at least say this. There are at least cases where the argument for genuine agency is much stronger than an argument for sentience. Nussbaum, in contrast, is more firmly exclusive of plants. They lack the kind of individuality seen in animals and that matters to action. And this, she says, is true even before we think about, even before we consider sentience. And it's true that plants are less definite as individuals, but some of what they do is like what we saw in the primrose. It has agency in the context of a tight collective or a quasi-individual. And then it's natural to wonder also whether being a less definite individual being a bit they-ish rather than, less of an individual, being a bit they-ish may not be as generally antithetical to agency as it is to sentience. Now, you might say at this point that you just want a category of action and agency in which sentience is included as an addition, just added on for use in the ethical context. This is what Nussbaum did in an earlier discussion. In her Tanner lectures, she said at one point, as the ethically relevant form of agency seemed to be spreading uncontrollably, that we should, quote, admit the wisdom in utilitarianism and just require sentience for the kind of concern that she was writing about, which is concern over justice. Now, that's not what she does in the newer book, Justice for Animals. There she does want to argue that a sentience requirement is a kind of natural condition on the sophistication of agency or genuineness of agency of a kind that matters. I put the key passage from Nussbaum's book on the handout there. We're now top of page 4, I think. But I'm not going to go through that. I think we basically go through the same sequence of moves that we go through, that we went through a moment ago with Korsgaard's book. So far in this section, agency, seeking the organism's own good, doing so by tracking local circumstances and responding, is all over cellular life. Animals do this in a complicated, targeted way, and a way that involves a reach into the environment that's unusual, made possible by the twin inventions of nerve and muscle. And sentience, I think, is spread widely. But the idea that sentience matters to the basic fact of agency, in a sense picked out by the kind of good being sought, I think is not so plausible. Sentience is spread widely, I said just now, but once again, as with yesterday, we need to at least look at the role of graded presence in that property. I said then, yesterday, that for general reasons and just looking at various kinds of animals, graded presence of sentience is a likely phenomenon. This is hard to describe using our present language. As discussed yesterday, the case of life as a category is an earlier case that seems similar and is now quite satisfactory. That provides a little bit of encouragement, but what can we do now while we wait for a better, finer-grained framework for discussing the grey area cases of sentience or felt experience? Well, we can't do that much, but we can press forward a little using the two elements that I used to make sense of the biology of experience yesterday, a more cognitive side and a side that draws on properties of nervous systems. One thing we can ask is, what if you have one of those two sides without the other? The idea is not that we can imagine having full human-like complexity in one side and not the other, but a faint, minimal version. Well, okay, but, and this came up yesterday, why not full human-like complexity without a nervous system? Philosophers are very much used to such an idea. People say it would not be too hard to realize a mind like ours, including experience itself, inside a computer. Mental properties are substrate independent or substrate neutral, and that's because they're functional properties. They concern what's done by the parts of a system, not what the system is made of. And so they say, we could slowly substitute artificial parts for the neurons in your brain, one at a time, preserving their functional properties. As there would be no change in behavior, given that functional sameness, it makes no sense to think that your experience would fade as the substitution is done. Now, I think the standard arguments for multiple realizability in this sense are not good arguments. As I said in question time yesterday, I was convinced of this by Rosa Cow here at Harvard when she was leaving neuroscience for philosophy and doing a postdoc with Sean Kelly. So the next bit draws a lot on her work. Functional properties, the things that philosophers talk so much about, what a system or part of it does, exist at all levels of grain. If we substitute a non-neural control system for a neural one, then coarse-grained functional properties may well be retained, but fine-grained ones will not. Now, philosophers, for some reason, and I really do think of this as a little bit of a sociological puzzle, a puzzle about the sociology and history of the discipline, got used to thinking of functional properties in a coarse-grained way and then talking about functional identity across systems that shared their coarse-grained functional properties, also locating the mental in those coarse-grained functional properties, and ignoring the fact that if the mental is functional, then there's no reason to think that fine-grained functional properties somehow drop out of the picture. Now, in reply, here talking from the point of view of the philosophical establishment, or classical functionalism, and drawing on more details of the case at hand, it might be argued that though this is generally true about there being coarse-grained and fine-grained functional properties and so on, the important properties of neurons in our brains I'm sorry about the voice, it just has been beaten up over the last couple of days. The important properties of neurons in our brains are especially portable across systems and hardwares. The important properties are the network properties, the local cell-to-cell influences, firing of this cell causing firing of that cell, and so on. If one thinks that that's all that matters in a brain, then it might be a special case. But in the first lecture I argued, also influenced by Cow and some other people, that this is not all that matters. A lot of what matters inside a brain is much less portable than that. So I reject classical multiple realizability arguments for that reason. So that means my view winds up being kind of mixed on questions of multiple realizability. There's lots of it within neural systems. Evolution just gave us that, and we can see it to some extent. But the use of multiple realizability within classical functionalism and in connection with artificial systems, I reject. Now, that's a general discussion of multiple realizability. In this particular context, talking about grey area cases, the questions do look different. We're not asking about the replication of human minds with human experience. We're asking about minimal and grey area cases, systems analogous to animals with simple nervous systems, but now with a different control system inside. And we wonder whether they would have something that we crudely describe as another form of felt experience, or crudely describe as something else, something a bit like experience, but not it. That's the question. And when that's the question, the status of cases like artificial systems and others that have part of the whole package looks different. Because then I think it is reasonable to think that there will, before too long, be artificial systems that are more brain-like in their construction, that do have some of the features of a kind of minimal subjectivity, that look like they're getting at the grey area also seen in the animal case. And on the other side, when we think about the other combination of presence and absence in relation to those two factors I talked about, there's also, both possibly and in early forms actually, systems that have some of the large-scale brain dynamics that I think are important, with none of the kind of cognitive features associated with subjectivity that you find in an animal. These are seen already to some extent in what are called brainoids, lab-grown collections of cells, nerve cells, that do take on spontaneously some of the large-scale oscillatory patterns seen in our own brains, with no body controlled, no sensors. The situation is a little bit like the case of Hydra with its rhythms that I talked about yesterday. But Hydra was a whole organism with things to do, even if there were simple things, whereas brainoids are really just producing neural dynamics in a subjectivity-free context. I think that future brainoid-like systems will raise questions akin to the questions that arise with robots and artificial systems with better hardware. Each is the sort of flip side of the other with respect to the two features that I used to explain the biology of experience in my previous talk. Okay, now we're getting to the last stage. And what I will do now is outline some parts of a general positive view of my own in the areas covered by this talk. Now, I'm going to start with the meta-ethical side, with what we might or could reasonably be up to when we make claims in this area. I said earlier that, especially in recent philosophy of mind, these issues around sentientism tend to be discussed in a way that has the surface properties of moral realism and intuitionism. Moral status or moral standing is treated as a real, natural, a real property, one that we learn about by considering possible cases and responding intuitively. Now, sometimes when pressed on this, people retreat right away. And this happened at the APA, the conference, American Philosophical Association conference last week in San Francisco, where in a talk on these issues, the speaker went through all sorts of considerations about the link between sentience and moral status. And when asked, does this mean, the surface pattern of this talk is a strong moral realism and intuitionism? Is that what you really think? The speaker said, no, not at all. I'm actually a sort of constructivist. I don't see any of these properties as part of the furniture of nature. It's a sort of special kind of preference or something like that. Now, this speaker, I think, and they said later that somewhat realist modes of talk in this area can be licensed by a subtle first order, a subtle role they can have in the first order discussion. This has been discussed by Simon Blackburn in Ruling Passions. I sort of don't think this is okay. I think it is better for the view of what status the debate has and a view of what status the options have. I think it's better for that to be on the table and integrated with the things that we say about the particular debates in question. And I'm a long way from moral realism and intuitionism, and this affects where things, I think, should come out on the immediate first-order issues. I should note also that Korsgaard's and Nussbaum's books are also like that. The meta and the first order are closely linked. So here is a general orientation to the ethical. And this, of course, will have to be very quick. I think that valuation is a basic thing that we do. Valuations are not reducible in general to something else, either to descriptions of how things are, expressions of emotional responses, commands, something like that. Valuation is its own thing. It involves putting options in order, choices, outcomes, social arrangements. Evaluation has a variety of manifestations in behavior and psychology, in discourse, action, and thought. Valuation in humans has various species, and ethical valuation is one of those. Ethical valuation is paradigmatically concerned with behavior in social contexts. Not always, but originally, I assume, and paradigmatically. Now that feature, its role in social life, gives it some distinctive features. Because this kind of valuation is social and has a role in organizing our affairs, disagreements very often can't just be let lie. They need to be resolved. We have to work out how to live, what to do. Another element distinguishing the ethical from other kinds of valuations also involves the social role that it has. Now, I assume that our ethical habits of thought and talk derive from earlier contexts in which norms were established and enforced in societies, often entangled in theology and sheer coercion. But a stage that can be reached, that is reached in many cases, is one where these valuations are brought into contact with our faculties for reasoning and public justification. When norms can be questioned and defended, considerations of parity become important. If you treated this case like that, why don't you do the same thing with this new case? Symmetry considerations, parity considerations become very important. pressure towards non-arbitrariness, I think, arises very readily and is a kind of ancestor to universalizability in the strong sense. Now, in some cases, including our present cases here with non-humans, pressure on valuations comes from parity plus new factual knowledge, where we learned that this case is more like other cases than we had realized before. This is a view in which ethical discussion of this kind has a goal, and that goal is the goal of reasonable valuation. Ethics is about defensible, hence systematic valuation that handles especially social questions. Now, the goal of reasonable valuation is not the same as a goal of representation of what's out there. What it answers to is different. In this view, there can be a lot of constraint, especially from parity and from the social embedding of ethical discourse, but there's also a good deal of inherent freedom of movement here. A person can choose how well integrated with the rest of their thinking they want their ethical orientation to be. And claims about parity are very dependent on which similarities between cases are seen as important and which are seen as irrelevant. They depend on our rather flexible sense of what is similar to what. Now, above, a moment ago, just briefly, I distanced myself from Simon Blackburn's absorption of realist meta talk, where you thump the table and say things are true in ethics. I distanced myself from his absorption of that talk into first-order ethical discussion. But also in the same Blackburn book, Ruling Passions, which I like, Blackburn has a label for his view. He calls it non-descriptive functionalism. Non-descriptive functionalism. Now, his actual view is not just that. It's too close to traditional expressivism, for me at least. But I think that category is a helpful category, non-descriptive functionalism. And I guess my view is in there. I guess I'm a kind of non-descriptive functionalist. The titles of these two lectures, Limits of Sentience, Boundaries of Consideration, are supposed to indicate a contrast between what we're doing in each case, roughly discovering the limits of sentience and deciding on the boundaries of consideration. Boundaries are things we put there. We can determine them reasonably or less so. With sentience, it's more a matter of discovery, and the claims we make are more answerable to what's there in nature. We may also end up changing, in an empirically motivated way, the shape of our overall view. Now, in the case of the non-human organisms and the problems that we're grappling with here, I think of our goal along the lines of the last few minutes. We have the goal, in general, we have the goal of reasonable or reasoned valuation, and in the case of non-humans, the particular goal of reasoned extension and modification of valuations. I think that's what we're trying, or at least might realistically try to do. So with all that on board and turning to the specific issues discussed, I endorse something like the sentience principle, with more to say sometime about the only direction of the claim as opposed to the all direction of the claim. Sentientism, or the sentience principle, is historically allied with utilitarianism and also suggests a generally experiential view of what is ethically important. That can take the form of either utilitarianism or some view within what I called welfarism earlier, but that can be rejected. In this lecture, I said, sentience runs deep, agency runs deeper. And that's what I think. But we can also then say, in the absence of sentience, agency does not matter. That's compatible. But also, in some classes within the class of sentient systems, agency matters a lot, and its role in reasonable valuation is not reducible to something hedonic. I think that's a coherent combination of views. I'll say it again. Sentience runs deep, agency runs deeper. But in the absence of sentience, I don't think agency matters. So you sort of knock off the bottom of agency. But in relation to complex organisms like ourselves, agency matters a lot, and its role is not reducible to something hedonic. There's no clash there. There is some failure of systematicity in agency looming very large in some contexts and disappearing from view in others. And in my view, failures of systematicity of this kind always generate some pressure in a context of challenge and justification. But that pressure is not the only one. That's not the only thing. Agency matters more at the top. It goes deeper than sentience, but it matters not at all at the bottom. Making one more reference back to earlier Harvard generations, this might sound a little bit reminiscent of the slogan that was discussed but not endorsed by Nozick in Anarchy, State and Utopia, where he looked at the idea of utilitarianism for animals, Kantianism for people. It's not the same as that, but I see the kinship. This is also quite close to what Nussbaum said in her Tanner Lectures, rather than in the recent book, when she said we should learn from the wisdom of utilitarianism and just bring sentience in as a certain kind of constraint on the view. But the outcome in the case she was talking about would wind up differently, would end up different from what she envisaged, because her project in that discussion was to find a way to sort of have mosquitoes on the other side of the divide. They might not be on the other side of the divide. Okay, the rest will have to be very fast, both for temporal and vocal reasons. I allowed and anticipated that sentience will resolve into finer-grained strands in a future treatment of this property. And I add now that when this happens, when it becomes clearer, ethical policies and valuations can attach to the strands. Different sorts of consideration can be in play for different features within the old package or the pre-existing package we call sentience. Secondly, in response to the gradient nature of sentience, we can always establish sharp boundaries for consideration if we want to, despite the graded nature of sentience, if we want, to the extent that we wind up with a graded property there in future treatments. This will again always be under pressure from parity, but parity it's not the only thing and doesn't have a kind of decisive pull. The role of the idea of moral consideration does change with these expansions. When the circle of moral consideration or ethical consideration is relatively small, there can at least be an ideal in mind in which everyone's more or less okay. When parity pushes us, when everyone's more or less okay. But when parity and new factual knowledge pushes us towards these really big expansions with lots and lots of animals changing their status, enormous conflict between agents, all with morally considerable interests, is just about inevitable. I mentioned the insect case as the sort of paradigm of that outcome, and there's a lot to think about there. Lastly, I've been rummaging around the deep and murkier parts of this non-human terrain. It's been what scuba divers sometimes call a muck dive, a dive in the mud, in the strange crannies, often uncovering the most interesting animals. We've been looking at distant parts of the tree of life and wondering about animals living long ago in the past. But I also want to emphasize that in the more familiar and the sunnier realms of the animal tree, there's also more going on inside the animals than had been suspected even recently. For example, self-control or delay of gratification, something that philosophers have quite often asserted is just not present in non-humans, has been found now in quite a few, in several birds, in primates, and even in cuttlefish. We've also found the anticipation of the future in the preparation of tools. Dreaming has become another area. David Peña Guzman gave a talk at the APA just now, following up on the book he published last year about dreams, now also talking about the wide range of animals who seek out mind-altering drugs and seem to do so purely for hedonic reasons. As Kristen Andrews said in discussion after Peña Guzman's talk, this is a nice case of evidence for positive valence seeking in animals. It complements all the endless work that's been done on pain. So all that's in place. And on the ethical side, modern industrialized farming, factory farming, remains, I think, the most pressing, the most important ethical issue in this area. Its abuses are so apparent and so visible from many ethical perspectives. So that's all in place. And we can also recognize through a dive like the one we've done here, a world in which simpler forms of agency are all around us and prompt us to ask new questions. Both of those things can be recognized. Both of those messages can be accepted. I'll stop there.
I'm going to suggest we try to take just a 3-minute break. Try to get back at 10 after. I'm sure it'll take a couple minutes. I know a lot of people have things to ask Peter, so I want you to have the chance. So back as fast as you can. Don't talk.
Not a word.
I was sure. His voice is going to give out just when the paper gives out. He doesn't know what to say.
David, thanks. I was very aware of the weird vocal.
No, you sounded fine.
It didn't sound too bad?
You sound...
Actually, someone at lunch said...
Did you turn that off? Are we recording?
I think we're recording this. Someone at the lunch said, you got to realize that the resonance of your voice in your head's different from...
I mean, you sound like your voice really sounds tired and raspy, but not totally...
It sounded fine.
Not nuts.
Just sounded raspy. A little deep.
Okay. A little bit of stuff there.
You didn't mention drinking or other causes.
That's true.
Nothing to do with that.
Events is the word you use.
Do you need to go back?
No, I'm fine.
Should I get the test?
Yeah, I realized which I thought maybe you should take the dinner. So we could go get it and bring it back.
What time is the dinner?
It's 7. You'd want to take it by 6:30.
Yeah, but why don't...
You think you can be back by 6:30?
Yeah, sure.
Really?
Well, why don't I come back at 6:30, take the test, have a little lie down,
Okay, good.
and then I wake up.
Tell them at the reception you leave, like at 6, like you gotta leave, but then actually.
Because that's an hour.
And your place is good.
Yeah, I can't do more than 10 minutes.
I feel like you should be responsible.
Why don't we get started and people can circle back in? So as Bernard said yesterday, raise your hand if you have a question. Make sure I make eye contact and get you on the list. If you have a follow-up, use a finger. And normally I would ask for graduate students first, but given the content of this paper, I would like to ask Chris to ask the first question.
People use the words pain and to a lesser extent pleasure in kind of a wider and a narrower way. Oftentimes, utilitarians, the earliest utilitarians certainly thought of pain and pleasure as sensations. And they thought pain and pleasures were sensations, not that some sensations are pleasant and some are painful, but that they were sensations. So it's as if anything that's pleasant, there's some kind of sensation humming along while you're having it. Now, when you distinguished stress and fear and so on as aversive expressions that are not quite the same as pain, it sounded as if you were using pain and pleasure in the narrower sense. And that made me wonder something sort of about your view of sentience in general, which is when you say that sentience and agency are not inextricable, do you think that agency can be extricated from sort of any form of evaluative experience at all?
Yes.
You think it can?
Yeah, I think it can be extricated from experience, felt experience of any kind. So I think the plants are like that.
You think that is a genuine form of agency?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I'll say just a word about the first point. When I talked about the contrast between stress and the like and pain, wasn't wanting to reify pain as a sensation of its own. The contrast was more with, you could put it in terms of adjectives rather than nouns and say it's a contrast between what's acutely painful and some other medium-term aversive experiences, stress, fear, and so on. Acute pain is what people always look for with animal welfare type work. And to me, it was a real surprise. I didn't talk about a ton of work that's interesting in this area. To me, it was a real surprise that the medium-term mood-like or emotion-like aversive states, evidence for them came along far more readily in simpler animals than evidence for acute pain, which is, I think, just kind of an interesting fact. Presses maybe unsymmetrical questions, but is just an important fact about aversive experience in animals. But the contrast was just supposed to be between acute pain and medium term. Some people who write about these mood-like states call some of them chronic pain rather than a mood-like state.
Well, I was thinking of something different from a mood-like state, I think, which is suggestive in a certain way, which is the very idea of aversive and attractive suggests a certain movement, a kind of towards or against, as if the experience of being pleased is the experience of moving towards the thing that pleases you, and the experience of aversion is the experience of moving away from it. And then agency and those kinds of experiences would be closely linked. I see what you mean about plants, but
I thought about this, something like this today, actually. I was wondering about something in the ballpark, and I might not be able to put my finger on it. It's not that going towards something that you regard as beneficial is itself pleasurable. It's a sort of sought goal. In the case of states like fear, it can be the immediate mover, what pushes you away, analogously to a kind of attraction. But the attraction need not be the sort of felt pleasure that is driving you to go where you're going. And I'm not sure where this goes, actually. And I wonder if we should go back to the first point about plants and agency and the rest, or do you see those as tightly linked, those points as tightly linked?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to think about plants, whether they have, as well as a reduced form of agency, some extremely reduced form of sensibility.
They have sensitivity.
Your responsiveness and your gradualism should make you open at least to the possibility that responsiveness is low level.
Yeah, in principle, one has to be open to that. I agree. Let me try to make this point a bit differently. The thought is, all action has a sort of fact-related and a value-related side. You want this, and in these circumstances, this action will get you this. In other circumstances, it might not. So there's a sort of factual side and an evaluative side, and expected utility models sort of encode that feature. It's always there, but the question of whether both sides are there in a way that's experienced, I'm treating as an open question. And you might have an organism for whom the evaluative side is just so straightforward, so never changes, so predictable that it doesn't need to invest in the kind of complexity that would be associated with experience on that side. And you might have the other. You might have an organism for whom the factual side was so predictable, so reliable, but there's some reason to complexify the evaluative side. I think of these as sort of open possibilities, and for that reason, this is now getting into a bit of the details. In some of the passages, there might be one on the handout. Maybe it's not on the handout. Yeah, it is on the handout. Sentient beings who perceive the world in valenced ways. Perceive the world in this is the bottom of the handout. The very bottom. The quote from Fellow Creatures at the bottom there. You can... One thing I'm saying is you can perceive the world in a way that is valence sensitive without being sentient. That would be one way of putting it. Now, perceive the world in valenced ways. Perhaps I think that's ambiguous between valenced feelings that are inherently evaluative, and tracking the world in a way sensitive to what's good for you. Perhaps I think both of those are possible ways of understanding what's referred to there.
I guess I didn't mean it in the more emotion-like way, that perceiving something in a balanced way was perceiving it as attractive or aversive in some way, rather than as just somehow carrying the information.
Right. Right.
Shall we move on?
Yeah, we can come back.
Ask you to keep.
Yeah, we can come back.
So now I will give preference to Godfrey. So Shelby.
Thanks for the talk. So within the range of creatures who have sentient experience, you suggested, I think, that amongst some of those creatures, agency becomes more important as maybe it gets more developed. I wasn't quite clear on what exactly you meant.
It's more important as a basis for the valuations that we make of policies and actions and arrangements and things like that.
Yeah, so you had also near the end of your talk mentioned that you think what's distinctive about moral evaluation, or one of the things that's distinctive, is the social character that it has. I wonder if do you think those are like related, or are those just like independent lines of thought for you? The like sociality and agency?
They're not super tightly linked, because a person could say, so let me think about this. Right, a person could say, if we're trying to understand why ethical discussion sort of works the way it does, then it's a form of evaluation where disagreement usually can't just be let lie because it concerns social life and how we're going to live. We have to resolve it. In certain kinds of communities, that means that there'll be challenge and defense. Parity will be a big part of the story in justifying why a decision or course of action is reasonable. All that stuff can be true, and then, as historically actually happened, you can wind up with a kind of pure act utilitarianism as a viable, defended, well-known position. So it's not as if the sociality on the kind of story about how ethical valuation works takes you towards an agentially grounded rather than a sort of more hedonic view of how people should live and how we should set up political arrangements. It's not tight like that. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say. So they are quite separate in that sense. There's a part of a story that has to do with understanding how ethical debate and ethical claims work, what they're answerable to, the idea that the goal is reasonable valuation rather than describing properties, goodness, and things like that. And the role of the social is a big part of that story. But then I think that once we're part of that project, once we're engaged in that game, the standard arguments against utilitarianism in favor of a more agent-sensitive view are good arguments. And by good arguments, I mean those are better valuations. I endorse those valuations. This is a better picture of, how we should evaluate particular courses of action and how we should arrange social life.
Hi. So, based on your saying that agency runs deeper than sentience, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sort of thinking that you want to say that you can't get a sentient creature that doesn't have any agency. But I was wondering if you think that rich sentience that we might be possible without with minimal agency, or if rich agency is a prerequisite for more rich sentience.
Are you thinking about cases where people are fully conscious, particular people are fully conscious, but in what appear from the outside to be a deep coma or something like that, or a future brainoid that is more fully cut off from the world by any senses, but nonetheless has... Is that the thought?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about that. I guess I was thinking more a creature that behaves in plant-like ways and is sensitive to their environment, but also has has the sentience that we think of, that's deep, complex sort of thought. And
why would it be there? Why would it have?
Why would a creature be there, or why would it?
Why would that rich experiential profile come to be in such a creature?
Well, I'm not wondering if it's. I guess I'm just wondering if you think that it's possible. I don't know if it would be a valuable or a creature that could live successfully. But I guess I'm just wondering how far apart agency and sentience to what extent one is a prerequisite.
Well, as you began your question, I began to think, right, all the way through these talks, when I talked about the link between sentience and agency, I'm talking about the kinds of beings and not special cases. I'm not talking about what might happen if you took a person who evolved and has normal human attributes and would normally be full of agential properties, and by means of interventions put them in a circumstance where they had no agential capacity whatsoever. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I should have said something about that. Just at least to sort of say I'm not thinking about those special instances. I'm thinking about the general relationship between sentience and agency in animals of various kinds, life forms of various kinds, and things like that. Do you want to ask about the guy in the coma-like state as an instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting case, but I'm also wondering from like a more naturalistic standpoint. In the coma-like case, it seems like a medical sort of defective issue.
Special case for that. Yeah, it is supposed to be the more systematic. Once we take the more, a viewpoint that's not guided too much by very unusual cases, the idea is that if you think about the history of animals, protists, those little single cell guys like paramecia, they are full of agency. They roam around, they track what's going on, a lot of predation, things like that. I didn't talk about them. I did the plant case for various reasons, but they are another case to think about where you have a lot of agency, no nervous system. They're too small to have a nervous system. And then the invention of animals was the invention of these giant colonies of protist descendants who have managed to pull their bodies together in a way that enables coherent action on this extraordinary spatial scale with these great big things that can act, that can move. Plants can't, fungi can't. It's an animal thing, being able to act in these ways. Agency is part of the animal way of being. And there are cases like sponges that don't do it, but in general, that's the case. And I do think that the sentient side, the subjectivity side, came along as, how we got there, how animals managed to do that thing. That's the story. And looking at kinds of beings and groups of animals around today, rather than looking at the history, I think things are as I said, sentience runs deep, shades off into grey areas, but you got the protists, you got the plants, you got the fungi, who are not bad on the agency side, despite just not being invested in this extraordinary thing, which is macroscopic motion of huge colonies of cells. That's what made us sentient.
Yeah, that's right. I also,
Alright, I'm gonna move this along. Sorry.
Thanks. Thanks, Peter. I'm right here. All right, so Shelby already asked a little bit about the meta aspects. I want to ask a little bit more to get clearer on the picture here.
Yep.
There's a quote from you in the talk. You say, limits of things we set, but boundaries of things we put there, and we can determine them reasonably or less so.
Yep.
So, question, this thing reasonableness, what is it, and does it have limits that we detect or boundaries that we put there?
I left that totally as a black box in the story. I'm hoping that the story would work with a variety of different views about what might be in the box. This came up at one of the earlier events this week. I've forgotten. Maybe it was. You've been at most of them, so you were probably there. I'm not sure it was our conversation though. Someone was talking about what kind of sort of meta-evaluative story you give about epistemic reasons, which are presumably in play at this part of my story. And I just don't know what to say about that. I mean, Slim next to you may want to weigh in on this topic. the bit that's essential to the story is the idea that we're concerned with sort of social norms as primary, norms of debate, justification, reasonable challenge, response to challenge. I do take this sort of the parity thing and the idea that the shape of ethical debate comes a lot out of demands for non-arbitrariness in a social setting. I take that quite seriously. So even in sort of relatively simple contexts, quite autocratic, perhaps a simple set of social arrangements, you can ask, why do I have to do this? And an adequate answer might be, we've always done it that way. This is how we live. This is how we do things. That is an answer. It's making the choice fit into a systematic picture in a very, very local, rather minimal way. And then as reflection and debate becomes more sort of open-ended and wide-ranging, more answerable to different kinds of considerations, and also when social arrangements become less coercive, it becomes more of a sort of, there can be more of a to and fro. Why have we got to do this? Well, you thought it was fine when we did this similar thing in this other case, so you should think it's fine that we do this here. That kind of systematicity, I think of as really, a very important element here. So one way of putting the point is, when I first heard there was a view called moral particularism, the idea that moral facts could be sort of wholly sort of isolated from one another, I thought of it as a complete category mistake. It's like, that's the one thing it can't be. They can't be isolated from each other in that kind of way. The whole point of the ethical form of valuation is to be able to make our valuations fit into a relatively systematic and parity-sensitive framework. So that side of it, that much of the black box's contents are essential. But what one says about all the rest of the things that people argue about in the area of epistemic reasons and things like that, or just reasonableness in discourse, I'm looking at Tim now. I don't know. I'm hoping that the story I'm telling is compatible with a range of box contents.
Can I get one more follow-up? All right, well, so just to kind of keep thinking this through, suppose I just don't experience any pressure toward parity in my ethical theorizing.
Yeah.
And I don't take myself to be thereby unreasonable.
Right.
And maybe I should convince those in my discursive community that reasonableness doesn't require parity. So now nobody's experiencing parity as a constraint in our systematic ethical theorizing. We're doing some ethical theorizing, but we're just not taking parity to be an important desiderata. Is there still something in virtue of which we're going awry? And if so, what is that? Or are we maybe just not really doing ethical theorizing in your picture, but rather some other kind of theorizing?
You're ignoring parity. What are you appealing to in this community to justify when something's challenged? Why are we treating this person like this? This is really awful what we're doing to this person. Why do they deserve this?
Perhaps you just point to particular features of each case, but we don't try to treat like cases alike.
And when a new case comes up, what happens?
Again, we point to particular features of the case, but we don't try to treat like cases alike.
Yeah. It might be one of those thought experiments I just find very hard to sort of get my head around in the sense I don't believe it could really work like that. And whether one says, right, I'm not sure, right, there's a few, one could say, it's not going to fly socially, it's not really coherent in the way it looks superficially, or this is something other than ethical debate. It's more more similar to other species in that evaluative genus. I take it that aesthetic evaluations are much less answerable to parity considerations, much less. Little bit. And there have been traditions in history of thought where people have thought it was important to systematize the aesthetic, but it doesn't have the same importance and grip that systematizing the ethical does, because we've got to work out what to do with each other. It's kind of compulsory in a way. I'm not sure. Maybe I should stop there and say I'm not sure beyond that.
So we're playing around in Slim's wheelhouse. Why don't you go ahead, Slim?
Oh, I was actually going to ask you something quite different. So, okay.
That's okay too.
So first, I guess an interpretive comment and then the main question. Partially because I want to hear about whether I'm right about the interpretive part. So I guess or maybe it's also I'm getting a little confused about exactly what strong gradualism is, because I feel like there are two ways that you described it, and so I think sometimes it's the view that there's like borderline cases of sentience, like no sharp boundary, and sometimes it seems like it's the view that sentience itself is gradable. And actually, it's just observation. Those two features don't necessarily go together. So we can have things for which there's borderlines that aren't gradable. So I think some actions, they're borderline cases being morally permissible, but they're not like less permissible than the definitely permissible actions. And you can also get the reverse. You can get cases of a sharp boundary that are gradable. So a chemical being acidic is gradable, but there's there's a sharp boundary when the pH trip goes from 0 to above 0. So anyway, but it looked like you wanted both in your picture.
Yeah, basically, I think the answer is both, I think, yeah.
But then my main question is, okay, so we've got sentience itself being gradable. So do you also accept a graded version of the sentience principle, on which the more sentient, the more worthy of moral consideration?
I don't know. I think that's I think that.
I mean, it seems like there's
right.
a lot of pressure.
I had a bunch of notes in the final section on that, and I wanted to make sure I said something about the consequences of the graded view for moral consideration. So I said a couple of things. I didn't discuss that one because it was going to take a long time, and I wasn't quite sure what to say in the area of, and this is something that people have, I think, discussed already a bit. The relationship between answering the question, is this entity morally considerable, with a yes, and then engaging in a very specific, somewhat unusual kind of consideration, right? Because of the way they live, we don't ask some of the questions we'd often ask. We ask some specific ones. I mean, a familiar case that has the same general shape is the claim discussed by Singer around Singer's point, around Singer's work, that if you don't have a sense of the future, it's okay to kill you painlessly. So that's adjusting the kind of consideration to the kind of being you are. But you're not sort of doing less considering. You're just giving a special kind of consideration. When I began to try to work out what to say about graded consideration, I found myself getting tangled up with respect to that distinction between gradations of consideration in the sense that should be intended here, and just considering, but considering, definitely yes, considering, but considering in somewhat unorthodox ways given the way that the being lives. I just couldn't get that sorted out. So I thought, I think I'll say some other stuff in the final section.
Next time we'll have a third lecture.
Can we wait a few days?
Well, I mean, just given the way you formulated it, in terms of being worthy of consideration, and worthiness of is gradable.
Oh, right. Okay, that's.
You're going to get graded in the.
I didn't
how worthy they are
see that. I didn't see that, but that's right. If you say requires, it's different.
Yeah.
That's a yes or no. But saying worthy is the right way to set up a graded property there, and that's not why I said it. Yeah. I said it just because I wanted something a bit weaker and less kind of. Just weaker, basically. But you're quite right. That is actually very helpful. Yeah.
I mean, it's going to affect, because at first it looks like you're saying, people are like, whoa, there's a lot of other things we got to worry about eating. But then now it seems like that cuts all the way on the other direction, because it's like, well, if they're much less sentient in some we've only shown they're much less sentient. Anyway, so it's the first order implication. It's going to swing all over the place.
This is very helpful. Yeah.
Gentleman in the pink shirt.
When you were at Stanford, did you know Deborah Gordon?
Yes, very well.
So just just very quickly to say that one thing that seems interesting to me is she's done the longest longitudinal study of ant colonies that's ever been done, and she's still doing it. And the ants that she looks at are ants whose queen lives about 5 years, and every other ant in the ant colony lives about 2 years. But you can tell the age of ant colonies, some of which are now 40 or 50 years old, by their behavior. Even though they're the same size as younger ant colonies, they behave differently. And some of that, so I think that raises the question of a relation of agency among insects, a relation of agency to sentience, to some things that look like they may be describable in moral terms. For example, the older ant colonies tend to be more erratic than the younger ones, even though the actual individual ants are, you can't tell by looking at individual ants, at any individual ants, or even if you take a sample of 30 ants, you can't tell how old the colony they come from is. That seems an interesting place to look at maybe a borderline between utilitarianism and some other, if you're looking at what, for example, to what extent you could call an individual ant's behavior self-sacrificing for the good of the colony, to what extent the ant has agency in that self-sacrifice, and to what extent that somehow the agglomeration of ants looks a little bit neuronal. And she and a friend of hers published an article on packet switching in internet protocols and comparison to how ants communicate. But it seems to raise a really interesting question in the context of what you're saying.
The question that seems especially pressing and interesting to me is one that it seems like a friendly thing for me, which is, at one point in the talk I said there are cases where there's a much stronger case for agency than there is for sentience, and colony level ant behaviors. From what you were saying, I mean, I follow the bee stuff a little bit. I don't really follow the ant stuff. Interestingly, all the bee people I know sort of either secretly or non-secretly think that bees are sentient. It used to be the case that none of the ant people I know said things like that. They just have differences in the animals, difference in the research sort of traditions. I don't know. Deborah might be someone, I'd be curious to ask what she thinks. But in the case of colonies, the psychological attributes you're associating at the colony level there make me think, right, this is a good example of a case where a case for colony level agency is strong. I think it's quite a lot harder to make a case for colony level sentience in a case like that. Like, the colony is seeking its good with its behaviors. Whether it feels the goodness at the colony level, I don't know about that. Harder, it's at least a gap there. Because it's, and then switching to the ethical side, if it's not sentient, then the agency doesn't have the moral importance it would have if they were sentient. So
the individual ants are sentient.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, not all insects, or even insects of that relatively small group, need to be on a par. I don't know.
Well, so I don't know whether this counts, but one of the ways that they behave is that outgoing ants that are foraging come back and meet other outgoing ants that are looking to forage, and they touch antennae and become, in some sense, aware of each other. And through that awareness, there's an emergent property maybe where they can tell how good the foraging is that day on the basis of how frequently they interact with other ants from the colony that they're recognizing through pheromones that are returning either too rapidly or sparsely.
Yeah, let me say, I'll just say one thing quickly in reply. I don't think that's enough. The fact that social relations can be discerned in animals and described in this kind of way, I don't think settles it. For example, although it's a bit controversial, in bacteria there's what's called quorum sensing, where bacteria of a certain kind will emit signals and detect them to work out, are there enough of my kind around for it to be worthwhile to do a certain thing that only makes sense if there's critical mass of similar bacteria. So quorum sensing, which involves signaling, we can give it this rich social description. It's very much an additional step to say that it's an argument for sentience in bacteria, I think.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up on Zoe's question about the meta-ethics of the non-descriptive functionalism, where we've got these valuations, including ethical evaluations, that are not factual beliefs. But we don't want to say that sort of anything goes. So because of the role they play in social coordination, there's pressure to end up with towards reasonable ones. And really, it's the reasonable valuations that set the standard. And this is sort of I don't know if it's a dilemma exactly, but sort of question about the black box, which is whether those assessments of reasonableness are themselves kind of valuation-like in that they're not factual beliefs. In which case, we're not going to want anything goes there either. So we're going to be started on this. We're going to want to say, well, it's reasonable assessments of reasonableness that really set the standard here, or it's going to be turtles all the way down. Or we're going to have to say, the question of whether some set of valuation is reasonable, that assessment is a matter of factual belief. And then it's not clear to me that what we end up with on that view is really a non-descriptive functionalism. It's more like, it seems like a kind of descriptive functionalism on which there really is a factual standard for correctness of evaluations. It's set by the facts about what's reasonable. So it's a question. One question about the black boxes are at least, should we think of assessments of reasonableness as matters of factual belief or themselves something other than?
Yeah, right. I'm not sure what kind of engagement is right, given my position with this kind of question, but let me just offer a few things. In the case of reasonableness on the epistemic side, there are truth-linked criteria that give you an independent hold. Which patterns of argumentation reliably take you from truth to truth. In truth, with respect to reasonableness on the epistemic side, gives you a sort of separate anchor to some extent in things. I don't know how much to make of that. I don't know if it makes a big difference or not. It's sort of a feature of a situation that it's there. Suppose the view ended up like this. I'm a valuer, an evaluator. We all are. We all evaluate. I want to be reasonable. I listen. I try to evaluate in a way that's sensitive to parity considerations and the like. I know that my sense of similarity of cases is not the same as yours, and that there's no particular reason to expect we'll get to all the same answers, even, after a long discussion and with all the facts on board, because I think the individuality, the distinctiveness across individuals of similarity judgments is just a feature of a situation. So I don't expect convergence, really. It'd be nice if it happened, but I don't expect it. And okay, the next bit I'm really not sure how to express. If someone asked me why I'm using these patterns of argument and justification rather than others, I'll give some more evaluations and I'll be willing to defend them as well. And then if the whole process goes up another level, I'll happily engage. I'll keep engaging. I think this is a little bit like what Dewey argued for in his book, The Theory of Valuation, which I've always found puzzling, but maybe I'm sort of recapitulating parts of it. And that seems like a sort of stable combination of views, even though there's not an attempt to kind of ground the reasonableness of the moves made at any particular level. Is that? Yeah. I'm really not sure. I mean, this part of the story is one of the parts I'm very unsure about how best to develop.
Awesome. Thank you. I was wondering about the relationship between sentience, interest, having a good, and then interest connected to something we don't necessarily want to endorse. So, it's, as I understood you, a thing is sentient, it has interest, which means it has a good, and so it's worthy of moral concern. If we take the minimal agency point that you said at one stage that artificial systems might have minimal subjectivity, which I take means that they're sentient at least in a minimal sense. It seems like the nation state could meet those conditions. But if we think the nation state is sentient, and then we say that what is sentient has interest, which means it has a good, then we're committed to the view that the nation state has a good. And I take it that it would have to be a substantive good in order for it to be worthy of moral consideration, not just a formal good, an interest in being an autonomous agent. And so then you'd be committed to the view that the nation state is a substantive good, but at least for many people that's really controversial. A lot of people think that the nation state doesn't have its own good, there's only the good of the members.
I don't think that nation states are sentient on my view, or I mean, that's linked to the ant colony case. I think they're better agents than they are sentient beings. Not as good as ant colonies, perhaps as agents even, I'm not sure. It depends on the case. So that's one thing to say. I think that agency runs deeper than sentience. Also, and I didn't emphasize this, but I realize I should have made this explicit at a certain point, because agency runs deeper than sentience, there are some subjectivity-related properties that also run deeper than sentience. I mean, sentience involves a cluster of those properties and the special features of nervous systems. But bacteria have a kind of point of view. And when they engage in quorum sensing, there's something they're after, and so on. Don't think they're sentient. I think nervous systems are special with respect to that side of things. So to talk about the agency of some of these non-neural or collective entities brings with it a certain kind of talk about subjectivity as well, but not the sort that becomes part of the story about sentience. That's what I would say.
Is that a follow-up? Okay. I apologize for my senior moment. I'm pulling out Gentil. I'm getting the name wrong.
Yeah, maybe this also connects this answer you just gave to the question. So what do you think about engineered life forms? So I work with engineers in a context where they're doing that. Think about the word like xenobots, biobots. So we don't even know whether we call them animals, or at least it's alive, it's life forms. And these life forms have, say, computer programmed agency. They move, for example, or they can swim, or have cilia, or whatever. So agency is there. And of course the big question is, and that's also often asked from me, like as a philosopher ethicist in this specific engineering circle, like where does moral considerability start? So I really find it hard to imagine sentience, but when you have a life form, you engineer it purposefully with agency, with the agency we want to give it. At what point does the entity become morally considerable, if ever? I must say I'm totally skeptic at this point.
Okay. With these engineered systems, something I didn't talk about, but is part of the picture and might have been implicit in my discussion of the good being sought by various systems. With a lot of artifacts and engineered systems, what they do only has goals that are imputed by us. They're a consequence of our perspective and our intentions in making them and bringing them into being. So, like well, what are they made of? They have a computer.
For example, of embryonic frog cells, but they can be made of any cells. They can be made of human cells.
So that they're a hybrid between a computer system and some biological material.
The computer system is telling them what to do. You tell the computer what you want them to do. But the system is biological.
Okay, I think I would have to have a close look. I might not be able to say something helpful about those systems right off the bat. Okay. Except the sort of off-the-shelf comment is partly, I think it's perfectly fine to just assert the sentience principle in situations like this. Doubt that these guys are sentient from what you've said, and so the moral question is then relatively straightforward. Whether they count as being non-sentient agents in the way that plants do, or whether they're non-sentient non-agents in the way that tables and chairs are, I don't know. Or like a Roomba robot type thing, I take to be non-sentient and really pretty questionable as an agent given the role of our imputed goals as opposed to its own good. People tell me I underestimate what's inside a Roomba, so
We got 2 more people on the queue in 4 minutes, so as briefly as we can. Zach.
Yeah, so this followed up on a couple of questions you've gotten about ant colonies and nation states. So I was trying to see, I don't find this view intuitive at all, but I was trying to see what it is exactly about your view that makes it so that an institution like Harvard University isn't going to be sentient. So you might think in certain ways it behaves like an agent, as an institutional agent, but also that it does things like it demonstrates characteristic aversions and proclivities. Like, for instance, a long time ago...
So do bacteria.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But also it demonstrates certain kinds of localized aversion. Maybe when Harvard really steps in a certain way, it's institutionally inclined not to do this sort of thing again, things like that. So the question is, I take it your answer to Caitlin's question about the nation states. You say that the mediation of this process by nervous system seems to be important to you, but I'd like to hear more about why, or what's the crucial difference maker, such that something like Harvard University, which, by the way, we do say sometimes we talk about it as hurting something in its reputation or its endowment or flourishing.
Yeah, it's
and it's obviously natural to interpret that as metaphorical, but
yeah.
What's the crucial difference?
There's more to say about this than I could possibly even sort of sketch in this context. I mean, the idea that the special properties of nervous systems matter here is a claim that takes a lot of defending. And that's what I think. And Harvard doesn't have a nervous system. It's comprised of things that have nervous systems, but the bandwidth connecting the nervous system in here and the nervous system there is, the kind of channel that exists there is nothing like the channel that exists between 2 parts of a single nervous system. It's a physically different thing with different sorts of dynamics and connectivity. That's what I would say. There's this nice literature that Christian List and Philip Pettit have pioneered especially on the reality of agency in groups, including not things like ant colonies so much, but deliberately designed human groups with rules for voting and decision-making and things like that. Harvard would definitely count. And they argue for a kind of reality to group agency, and that would then be another case where you might say the case for agency is much stronger than the case for sentience, and we shouldn't regard those as just the same, the same argument both times. It's a different argument.
Lane, you've got the last question. Go ahead.
I think this is a simpler question and one that you've probably answered multiple times. But along the way, you sometimes describe actions that they don't necessarily prove that the creature has the capacity for felt experience, but they at least invite actions that invite thoughts that they might. For example, wound tending, and the moment when the hermit crab inspects its own shell to see what induced the pain, and maybe some of the things with decorative crab. I'm just wondering two things. One, do you have a general description of actions that particularly invite your sense that they may have the capacity for felt experience, and then the specific example is in a case where a creature clearly is practicing something, not just repeating something to master it, but carrying out an activity that's different from the final. Would that be one of those that might invite that kind of thought?
Starting from the second, yeah, that's an interesting case. Suppose you're more of a sort of restrictive person than me, and you think that fewer animals are likely to be conscious. Suppose you're Stan DeHaan, and you ask DeHaan, well, what is a mark of consciousness in action? The thing he will say is the production of novel, temporally organized sequences of actions. He thinks that's special. That's a level of evidence for consciousness that's, even if your bar is very high, as his is, that clears the bar, or at least, is a strong contender. So with respect to practice type behaviors, yeah, that would be actually a good example, because the behaviors are novel until the sequence is novel until it's routinized. And the sort of piecing together of the acts would be then a good example. On the first part of your question, right, there's a sense in which I think the principled answer is, it's not some single action. It's never some single action. Any single action might have all sorts of explanations that take it away from an interpretation in terms of felt experience. What was distinctive about the Crook experiment with octopuses that I talked about, and also the hermit crab stuff and some other stuff, is there's a bunch of manifestations of what looks like a state of the whole system that's, having these various upshots that all make sense if it's an aversive experience. You're a hermit crab. You're trying to work out what the hell's going on with your formerly very comfortable shell. You'll give this shell up because it's driving you nuts, but not if there's a predator nearby. Then you'll sort of put up with it for a while. You'll give it up, but not if the only other available shell looks like it's so low quality that you'd rather just deal with any one of those things might have an explanation that sort of takes you away from an experiential sort of treatment of what's going on. Put them all together and it's different. Same with the octopuses in Crook's experiment. And the case I used today was I'm looking for something that just has that tiniest but real glimmer of that, is the nociceptive sensitization in snails and things like that, where something bad happens and suddenly everything just seems crap, and scary, and you react defensively and negatively to stuff that you would normally regard as no big deal. So that's a kind of tiny case of what is seen in a more striking form in the hermit crabs and the octopus experiment. And in each case, it's not one thing. It can't be one thing. It's got to be a bunch.
Okay, hang on. I'm gonna first invite everybody to continue the conversation at the reception next door. But yeah, let's engage in some collective conscious agency.